Okay, I'm gonna get us started. Okay, folks, welcome back from our break. Another round of applause for that first panel. Fantastic conversation, and thank you all for your questions as well. Hopefully you've had a chance to get some coffee, mingle a little bit. We're gonna turn to panel 2, Principles of Equity, Privacy, and Security, how data can be utilized effectively while also preserving our values. Our moderator for this panel is Adam Heckman, the founder of For Good Advisory, where he helps nonprofits and funders define their data strategy, use their data to impact their mission, and leverage analytics and data science to collaborate with their partners and key interested parties. Adam also works with commercial businesses on their corporate social responsibility strategy and programming. Adam is a 30-plus year veteran of Microsoft, spending much of that time in social impact roles, and is an adjunct professor of computer science at DePaul University College of Computing and Digital Media. And in whatever spare time is left, he is a volunteer computer science teacher at Austin Career and College High School on Chicago's West Side. So I'll turn it over to Adam to introduce our panel, and welcome Adam and our panel.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Joe, and welcome to Principles of Equity, Privacy, and Security, how data can be utilized effectively while also preserving our values. The last panel was fantastic, and it couldn't have worked out better in how it feeds into this topic. In the prior panel, you heard some really inspiring and interesting things about the potential for data to deliver solutions or at least contribute to solutions to urban challenges. And you heard some of the interesting challenges that are inherent in just doing that. I took some notes on that panel, and I heard some things that feed directly into what we're going to be talking about next. I heard build, and share from Nick, wherever Nick is, which feeds right into also feeds into the ethos of Shy Hack Night. I heard from Lori, data collection is not always being collected and curated by humans. And there's something to be said for how the principles of data collection have to take into account that. We heard the value of standards, sharing, and opening from Frederica. I think that the fact that my coffee grinder talks to my coffee maker is at least as monumental as the railroad companies standardizing on their rail infrastructure. And then we heard about the premium of usability, explainability, and good metadata, which again feeds right into the principles. So this panel's focused on, what are the risks, what are the dangers of relying on quantitative data alone to inform decision-making, as well as some of the trade-offs that are inherent in ensuring equity, building and keeping trust, protecting privacy, preventing misuse, and also ensuring that data is secure, which kind of underscores all of that. So here we're going to think about risk. We're going to think about how much risk is too much risk. Is it possible to have usable data and not replicate the biases and reinforce the systemic racism and other inequities? And for those questions and more, we have a terrific panel here. These are 3 people with 3 very different perspectives and purviews. So I think, Joe, you curated a perfect panel for this so we can get a nice 360-degree view of this. To my immediate left is Daniel Ollello. He's the CEO of Kids First Chicago. Daniel brings quite a bit of not only quantitative analytical skills, but also some lived experience in his role in supporting parent-led and data-informed change within Chicago's public schools through Kids First. And we have Rosella Branson, Rosie. Rosie is our Chief Data Officer for Cook County Government Bureau of Technology. She's been doing this for, 2 months? But she actually is a very highly experienced, that's true, she's been in the job for 2 months, but she is a very highly experienced data professional. She's got over 15 years of experience in managing, analyzing, reporting on data for a variety of organizations. And as the current CDO, Chief Data Officer of Cook County Bureau of Technology, she's the one who's responsible for leading the organization's data management and analytics initiatives. And to Rosie's left, we have Omar Duque. Omar is the president of HITECH, Hispanic Information Technology Executives Council. Omar is a staple in the community. He's an impact-driven leader. He's working to empower the next generation of Hispanic technology leaders with HITECH, which empowers tech professionals, Hispanic tech professionals, to accelerate the power and the impact of technology leaders, achieving lasting equity from the classroom to the boardroom. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you.
So first, to get things started, as I mentioned earlier, you all have very different roles, different perspectives. Data feeds into all of it. Tell us what let me just go down the line and ask our panelists, describe what your role is in using data so that we understand where you're coming from. I can go this way. Omar, let's start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Adam, thank you for moderating today's panel. Thank you to UIC Urban Forum for having us. This is a very important conversation. I'm happy to be a part of it. So I, in an interest of full disclosure, I am not a technologist, yet, have worked a significant number of years in the technology space, both as the president of HITECH and prior to that ran the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for 11 and a half years, and really kind of led a move to have Hispanic businesses think more about building digital businesses, scalable businesses, partner with 1871 to start the first of its kind incubator for Hispanic technology tech startups. But in my capacity at HITECH, and I appreciate that Dean White said this when she opened her comments today, that behind technology are individuals. There are humans. That is exactly what the Hispanic Technology Executive Council does. We work with senior level professionals and executives that are the ones building and implementing the technologies that we use today, creating a forum for them to share ideas, and then also working with the broader community to create pathways for Hispanic youth, young Hispanic professionals to think about building careers in technology.
Fabulous, thank you. Yes, and you definitely bring the experience with the human level of thinking. And speaking of human level, Rosie, you're human, and you and your constituencies are mostly human. Let's hear what your role is in data.
So as Adam stated, my role is relatively new. I started as a chief data officer for Cook County towards the end of January, beginning of February. So a lot of my responses are going to be colored by like my previous experience as a data analyst, because that's what I am at my core. I'm a data analyst who just probably cares a little bit more than most about the governance and the infrastructure of reporting. Previous to my current role, I was the manager of data science and insights for Chicago Public Schools for about 3 years. And so I have spent a lot of my career being very hyper-focused on the reporting end of it, and just kind of growing frustrated with running into continuous roadblocks with my reporting because of all of the data quality issues. And a lot of those issues stem from like the source, not appropriately training people on how to collect and manage this data, not consulting with analysts when you're building out systems and ensuring that they have a really clear understanding of what's going in on the front end so it can better inform what they're reporting on the back end. And just as I've kind of progressed in my reporting, I got so much more involved in that. And just came to see that like not all organizations value that governance aspect of it. They want the flashy reports, they want the insights, but they don't want to invest the time and the resources that are required to make it good, to make it real, to make it meaningful. So I have really spent like, I guess probably maybe a good of the last 5 years of my career kind of focusing more on that governance and infrastructure and kind of pushing towards that, which is kind of what landed me where I am right now. And the county is in an interesting place because, like I said, I'm a data analyst at my core, and I thought I was going to come in here and lead a team of analysts and start chucking out reports, but they're not there yet, not collectively. So the county, where they're at right now, has been embarked on a mission to modernize systems across all of the agencies and bureaus, many of which were working off of legacy systems that don't really connect to anything now, or off of like Excel sheets or paper and pen. So a lot of the energy has been focusing on getting everybody's tech up to a modern level. So now that we're in that place, we can discuss now how do we integrate all of these various data systems, because the county has an interesting structure where all of the agencies and bureaus operate independently. They all have their own data systems, they have their own ways of collecting their own data and tracking and doing their own thing. I have been tasked with trying to find a way to integrate some of this data, to standardize it so that we can do collective reporting on the impact of county initiatives and programs, especially where these initiatives and programs go across multiple agencies. So right now, I'm most focused on trying to establish that infrastructure, establishing a data warehouse where we can safely and securely transfer this data to, building relationships with all the different agencies and bureaus, and establishing that trust that if they share this data with us, that we will be good caretakers of it. We have the governance in place to ensure that it stays secure, that it won't get leaked out, that we're going to use it effectively, that only the appropriate people that need it will have access to it. All of those things have to be put in place. So I'm probably a little bit ways off from just checking out reports, but I'm excited that President Preckwinkle and her staff have given me the space and the opportunity to do this right. I'm very excited about it.
Rosie was telling me yesterday that her engagement with data goes well before her career. You know, she knew she wanted to do something that was data related as early as high school, which is, you know, not a lot of high schoolers knew that they wanted to do stuff with data. And it goes back to something that Lori said, how important it is to be developing the next generation of data users, data practitioners, et cetera. And speaking of that next generation, Daniel, what is your current engagement with data right now?
I like your segue.
You like that?
Yeah, I appreciate the youthful vibe.
Kids First Chicago.
That's right. Kids First Chicago. So I think I'll start with just a quick, who are we? Because I think one of the things that we talk a lot about at my organization, and I'm the founder and CEO of Kids First. We started in 2015, and it was just me and a laptop, honestly. And the idea right from the beginning was we wanted to give parents the microphone, and it was really just an idea, and we were very lucky to be in that place to kind of build something from there. But what I feel, or what our team feels, is missing from the conversation in Chicago Public Schools is a balance and power where parents, like the everyday parent, are included in the discussion about what happens to their own kids. There's kind of this triangle of power that exists in affluent communities between teachers and administration. Sometimes the administration and the teachers are one prong of, or two prongs of that, and then parents have a role that's implicit. And then you come to places like Chicago where structural racism has boxed out certain families for generations and they don't have a voice. And so a big part of our work is understanding where the consensus of Black and brown moms and dads are on issues. And often, so we talk about distorting the facts, like we want to take the reports that we see, that you're producing, and make them accessible to moms and dads on their time. From an equity standpoint, we got to meet them where they are. And I'm not talking about like them understanding the data. I'm talking about like on their time frame, like weekends, nights. Like they don't have time to go and pull up reports that help them understand all kinds of different issues that are crossing the system. But our job is to try to make that accessible to them and then allow them to have the time to kind of weigh what they're seeing in that information and then tell us what they think the solution should be. It's a very Paulo Freirean model. It takes time to do, and it often puts us in a place, and Freire talks about inventing a new reality. It often puts us in a place where parents want to go is not popular with the ideologies that are already existing and have a lot of power. And so we're often in the middle of this kind of like maelstrom of, you guys are not representing properly, you're not doing all these things. But when we think about stewarding the facts and data, like it's one route is like, okay, we have to provide the information that's accessible to families where they're at. But the data that comes back from that is what they tell us the solutions are. And we need to then bring that into spaces that aren't used to hearing from these constituents, right? So our job is, and frankly, like the best way we do that is we just show up with the parents and we say, don't listen to us, listen to them. They'll tell you what the issue is. But if you don't corroborate what you're seeing in the data, then it's very easy to make mistakes. and to do things to people that causes harm. And by working directly and proximally with parents, that has been a really important feature of our work in terms of elevating solutions that align to, the data sound like they say one thing from the ivory tower, but they really mean something completely different when you get on the ground.
Yeah, the quantitative data alone doesn't tell the entire story. It needs to have some context. And the kids and families are Kids First Chicago's purpose. Parent inclusion is key. And if you're going to be getting information and data from parents, you have to establish trust. In fact, I'd say all three of you understand that trust is a key dynamic of data access. Trust is very hard to earn. It's very easy to lose. What steps can organizations take to build trust and accountability with individuals when collecting and then using their data, particularly in light of recent high-profile data breaches and privacy violations? Rosie, can we start with you on that? I know you've thought about this.
Just a little bit. So it's a big thing for people to turn over their data to you. And I think one of the things that frustrates me the most is when I see people who have access to that data that have kind of a lack of respect for it. I know people think I'm crazy because they're like, it's just numbers on a file. No, these numbers represent real people and their experiences. In the case when I was working at CPS, like some of these data files had these kids' futures in them, their grades, their assessment scores. And I would see people just like send things in emails, or I would get like big data dumps that had kids like, I don't want to get too specific and get people in trouble, but had kids, academic information in there, and it was mixed up with like kids from other districts, like it was just downloaded and dumped and then emailed on to us, and all of that is wrong. That's why, and I keep going back to, there needs to be an infrastructure and governance in place to manage this data. You need to demonstrate to people that, yes, we're going, like I said, to be very good caretakers of your information. We have these very secure systems in place. We have processes in place. We're tracking who is putting eyeballs on what. We are managing individual access. Only people who need access to specific data points get access to that data. Being very clear and upfront about that, and also being very clear with people about what you're doing with their data and why you're collecting it. I also have issue with when people just, collect 1 million data points just for the sake of collecting, like, oh, I might need it sometime in the future. You cannot do that. You have to be very intentional about where you're collecting, because it's invasive for people to have to give up all of this information. You need to be targeted. You need to be very specific about what you're using it for, how long you're going to be using it for, how long you're keeping it, how are you going to destroy it, where is it going to be maintained, who's going to have access to it. All of that has to be laid out when you're getting initial permission to collect data. Again, these are not things that are fun that people like to talk about or like to do, but it has to be in place, especially when you're dealing with sensitive personal data like academic data at schools or, people's property tax data. There needs to be a level of respect with it, and that people need to be conscious of protecting it at all times.
I like that concept of data respect. That in itself could be a field of study. Omar, you heard some things in the last panel that resonated with this concept.
Yeah, and I kind of want to go a little bit deeper on trust.
Please.
Because I think trust is core to everything. Unfortunately, we're in a global crisis as it relates to trust. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, right now it's causing, political divisiveness, social divisiveness on all levels. And this is just trust in general. And I think we have a responsibility as keepers of data to make sure that when we build these systems, when we build these standards, that we are thinking about how we're layering trust into every single aspect of it. Because if if it falls apart, then the whole thing the whole thing can fall apart. I love the saying, right? You gain trust by drops, and you lose it by buckets. Earlier, we were talking about Laura, I think you were talking about the transportation data and that public transport, and that's incredible, right? That we have this data, that we're able to track it, that I'm able to pull up my phone and know when the next bus is coming, know when the next train is coming. It's a process, right? But when you have the situation that Chicago Transit Authority has right now with this ghost buses, that breaks that trust. And it creates real problems. I think the other piece, Rosie, that I think is key is accountability, right? And you have to be clear. So transparency is important. Why you're collecting it. Always thinking about going back to the table and saying, okay, do I really need this data? How do you minimize what you're collecting? How, to your point, with the timeline of when you're getting rid of stuff and how you're getting rid of it. But thinking about accountability. At the end of the day, there has to be accountability. There has to be accountability, whether it's for public agencies, for individual leaders, for companies, and individuals who have maybe been hurt or harmed in some way. There has to be a way for redress, right? Because if not, then that trust just isn't there.
Nick on the last panel had talked about generative AI and large language models, and in some respects, this technology couldn't have come at a better time. In a lot of respects, probably even more, couldn't have come at a worse time. It'll help us think through some existential problems that the entire planet is facing. But like you said, across the board, trust is so low that this could be a real problem. And when you think of some of the risks that are one level above trust, I think of the risk of misinterpreting data, lack of empathy, what Daniel calls proximity to the challenge for what's being measured. Daniel, tell us about where you've seen this. I know you talked to me a little bit about the notion of the quote unquote achievement gap. Tell us that story.
Yeah, I do this work largely because I feel like my entire life has been defined by this thing called the achievement gap. I grew up the middle of three boys. We were the only kids of color in a very small, rural, all-white town, and the achievement gap was a marker, even at a young age, for us. Just the anti-blackness that was pretty prevalent. It was pretty explicit where I grew up. I even looking at this chart that they draw here, it's hard for me not to stratify and think about all of these charts, including how you measure education outcomes into racial categories. And it always looks the same, and it's looked that way for 100 years. And so my story and my brother's story diverge when I got lucky and ended up in some place that threw a million resources at me. And I'm sitting here on this stage, and I knew when I was coming up I would be thinking about him because he spent most of his adult life incarcerated, battling addiction. And if you were to ask people in our hometown, where we were, they would expect him to be where he is, and they'd have a very different perspective on me. And I don't buy into the notion of exceptionalism. I don't buy into, my entire life I've been trying to figure out why. What did I do that changed moved me from this line that I'm supposed to be in to a different one? And for most of my life, I thought it's called the achievement gap. So it's saying that we have to work harder. We have to do more. There's all these things. It emphasizes the individual. And frankly, it's my brother and my story kind of in parallel, that I'm he's just as capable as I am. He can do all these things. But I got lucky. And a couple facts, since we're talking about data, that jump out. The human genome gets unpacked. I needed that to happen, right, for my own personal psyche. And what it said was what my father had said all my entire life, we're all human. Melanin is literally a molecule. And yet it defines every single chart, whether we're measuring heat indices, tree canopy cover, academic outcomes. And it stratifies according to a social construct that we made up across all of these things. So we're not measuring achievement at all. And it's personal for me. I want to destroy the achievement gap because I think it's a lie. To me, we're measuring discrimination. It's a discrimination gap. And because we don't have it attributed as such, we've given it a different name, we approach the problem the wrong way. We're too focused on the individuals. We're kind of victim blaming in a sense. And sure, people can work harder and do more, but they're inside a context in a lot of cases that we are not taking into account, and we're not thinking about the structures around them. And you said systemic racism before, structural racism, that's what we're measuring, and I feel like if I were to rename it, I would call it the discrimination gap.
And thank you for that story, and I like the concept that we're all humans, but we're operating in this complex context. And speaking of which, Omar, you work with senior level leaders. You work with those in the C-suite, and they have no choice. But I mean, this is what their job is to think about their organization's principles and the human elements of that. What are some of the human elements we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you build sort of the framework for data collection, data use, back to what I said earlier, right? Like, you have to think about, first of all, who that data belongs to, right? And recognize that your data belongs to you. And respecting the fact that it belongs to you and creating and making sure that we're creating space for privacy, right? And you talked about, data breaches, and they happen all the time. But how are we working to, number one, acknowledge that it's your data, make sure that we have your consent for that data, and working as hard as you possibly can to make sure that you're protecting it. Number two, I talked about this earlier, just being transparent. Why are you collecting the data? What are you going to use it for? And in the sake of for social use that we're using, right? There are benefits. There are also trade-offs, right? Disparate impact of some of the data that you might be collecting. And then for me, again, accountability. And this is where, I think leaders have such a major role to play, because you have to have people that are constantly reviewing, constantly checking to make sure that at every single phase in the process, that you're correcting any gaps and that you're always going back to check. For example, we have this idea that algorithms are this infallible thing, but algorithms feed on the data that you're giving it. Mm-hmm. And so if the data that an algorithm is being given is biased, then you are going to continue to produce biased results. And this is why it's so important to have diverse leaders that are responsible for constantly reviewing this. There's the example of an algorithm that, from a hiring perspective, that will give you, I'm looking to hire, I'm a hiring manager, I'm asking this algorithm to give me candidates that I could potentially interview. But if I, as the hiring manager, am choosing to hire only white males, I'm telling the algorithm, these are winners, send me more winners, and so then I'm only going to be getting more resumes from white males. And recognizing that, that individuals have a role to play in correcting this and knowing when and how to override some of the outputs that we're getting from these algorithms. And that's the accountability.
So that I heard transparency, equity, accountability. These are principles. I come from the commercial tech space, and in the perfect scenario, you'd start with principles, and you would have those principles feed into standards, which we talked about on panel one, and those standards would eventually translate into specific engineering guidance that you can put into place. So if defining a set of principles around data use is essential to creating responsible and trustworthy data systems, especially as analytics, AI, et cetera, move into the mainstream, I want to ask about what some of those other ethical principles are. Rosie, you're a new leader. You're not a new leader. You're a leader in a new role. You're leading a significant organization that has to think about this. As a leader, what are some of the ethical principles and values that are going to guide you and your team in your work, if they exist?
A couple of things. One, and I don't know, we keep coming back to the accountability thing, but it's not enough to just kind of set guidance and regulations. You really have to follow up on it, ensure that people are going along with those guidelines. And when they aren't, there has to be, some real follow-up, or else the bad behavior will continue. We need to be sure that the data that we are collecting is being used for its intended purposes. People should not be able to take that data and say, hey, you know what, this would be really useful, and I'm going to use it for this over here. You can't do that unless we got permission from the person you collected the data from. So it's kind of like a constant vigilance kind of thing, where you need to, constantly be reviewing your use cases. What are people doing with this data? Is it in line with what we said we were going to be doing? And if not, how are we going to correct that? So that's a really important piece. Another ethical thing is, like right now I'm being asked to consult on some sensitive policy issues, and I'm like, well, this is interesting. I didn't think as a data analyst I'd ever be asked upon for that, but in terms of, let's say, the race ethnicity constructs that were just mentioned, I don't know if everybody's aware, but the federal government is currently proposing making modifications to the current guidelines for the definitions of race and ethnicity for the purposes of census data collection. And I personally feel it's long overdue. The current categories and definitions do not reflect the diversity of our communities, and it's a big, big problem. It's a problem because these racial categories are basically what decides where funding goes, how resources are allocated. It's a really big deal, and it's shameful that it has been since 1997 that this has been reviewed, and our population is changing so quickly. So I have been asked to weigh in on that, and it's exciting to be able to have a part in trying to push that work forward, but also it kind of weighs heavy on me because I know there are so many consequences that could come from whatever decision we land on and how we implement this. You just have to always be mindful that when you're making these policy decisions, it affects real people. It's going to have very big implications, and take that to heart and try to be as formed as you can and be as fair as you can.
You seemed a little surprised that they were asking you about policy. I take great comfort in knowing that they turned to the chief data officer to weigh in on policy. I think that's a positive. And you also mentioned the consequences, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we do that, Daniel, I want to ask you, you have both lived experience and studied the data use and behaviors around the taxonomy, around what you're measuring and things like that. What are some of the strategies for describing what acceptable behaviors are when using data and how it guides some of that timeless values? You'd brought up measuring achievement gap is not a great behavior. What are some of the strategies for changing those behaviors or describing what acceptable behaviors are in the civic space?
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm thinking a little bit about the two last answers too, because I think they connect to this. But the point you were making, Omar, about who's ultimately consuming the data is the way I would phrase it, and similar from Rosie. But who is the end user, I think, is an important question. Yeah. And I feel like we often design data thinking about the end user as people like ourselves, sitting in, I'll use ivory tower, but sitting in rooms where we're thinking about what do these data mean and how is it, and I often think we miss the opportunity to think about who really owns the data, to your point, Omar. If the data is about me, then they're my data. And this notion of nothing about us without us is really important. And if we were to think more along that framework, I think we would design data differently. We would look at all these charts, everything we're producing. If we were we got to put this in front of, in our case, a parent, and they have to understand it in 10, 15 seconds, that's a very different type of resource than what we often make. And for us, going back to your question, a big part of our work is how do we right now play the role of translator, right? How do we take this information that's sometimes it's just in Excel spreadsheets and it's not contextualized in any way that's helpful. No offense to the CPS data portal, I use it all the time, but we have to piece stuff together from there. But the work that we do is how do you make this really easy for someone who's got a lot of things going on in their lives to look at and know what it's telling them about themselves? And how do you do that in a way they're proximal to whatever's going on, that when they see what the data are telling them, they can tell you why. Because we don't know from where we are. But we often cast judgment based on, okay, we see all this information, it's built for us, they can't engage with it, and then we're telling them, oh, this must be what's wrong, right? Whereas proximity matters.
And this is one of the things that I'm really excited about for some of the new generative AI tools, when you can actually apply those tools to your own data. I think of what, the Google integration, Bard, right? You put that into 15 years of me having a Google account, and that's going to put out some, I think, really kind of telling things about me personally. That's my data. I want to see that, but I think of like when we can apply some of these tools to our own educational history, our own medical history, that is leveraging these new AI tools for and empowering individuals on their own data, and that's something I think is really exciting.
And first of all, I'm glad you brought up the distinction between the end user, as we as data practitioners sometimes think of it, and the actual beneficiaries. It's like, as data practitioners, we don't go far enough. And Omar, your point, there are trade-offs. In other words, let's talk about what in your spaces, what you each feel are the trade-offs. How can we leverage this potential and balance out our values and address some of the challenges with how we collect and how we use data in your worlds? Rosie, maybe we should start with you on that.
Well, I can think of one particular example. Luckily, I left CPS before I had to do anything about it. So recently, the state passed an ordinance that was requiring the school districts to start collecting and reporting to them on students' their sexuality preferences. We had already just started collecting whether students identify as non-binary, and that was a project. And it was difficult because, again, like other government organizations hadn't changed their systems. The state, the federal government, they were all still doing just male-female. So we were having to jump through hoops to transform our data on the back end so we could report out when we knew we were on the right side of history. Thankfully, that all has been changed since. But when this came down, they wanted us to also ask about and track sexual preferences for children, I gave pause because I was like, okay, and you want us to put this in our data security systems where it could potentially be FOIA'd or leaked, and then we're worried about, what could potentially happen to these children whose parents may not know. And then also, how do you ask kids this question? Are we going to ask parents, or are we just going to ask the kids what's your sexual preference? All of it didn't sit right with me. And I just did not see how we were going to comply with that. Again, because I just personally, talking about trade-offs, didn't feel safe having that information in our data systems, knowing what I knew about our data systems. I feel like some things might be a little bit too personal for government organizations to have. I don't know, that was just my personal opinion. And I felt like that was a really thorny ethical issue. Now, I understand the state's interest in doing this is because they want to try to ensure that there's no discrimination against specific populations, and that's why they want us to ask. And I get that, but at the same time, I'm like, you can't guarantee that we can keep this data safe and that we can keep these kids safe. And until you can, I just can't fathom collecting that information. That was something that happened for me personally.
An intense yes. Intense change when governments change, right? The intent may be very positive
Exactly.
Right now in Illinois, but would you be okay collecting that same information in Florida? Probably not. It's a dangerous thing. What are some of the trade-offs in your world?
I think the biggest one is time. I mean, for our work, like it takes time to engage. We're trying to create a participatory democracy is one way, but like radically inclusive democracy, like taking information to the human being on the other end of it that doesn't have time to engage with it necessarily. You have to find that time and helping them understand it and then tell you what they want to do about it. That takes time, and I feel like our systems are designed to respond to timeframes that are often attached to political agendas or timelines, or arbitrary timelines that we set. And so what we run into all the time, and we're running into even now in some of the work that we're doing, is this notion of we need an answer tomorrow, but nobody wants to take the time to get the right answer from the individuals that have the most at risk.
Yeah, there's the disconnect between the timelines between political timelines and our daily lives and what matters to us as constituents timelines. There's also differences in risk tolerance, right? We don't elect our elected officials to take a lot of risks, right? But we expect the business community to take a ton of risks. But we're also asking the business community to do that in a principled way. We have some, do we have, Kylie, do we have time for questions? Okay. At this point, I'm sure everybody in the audience has something from this panel that's gotten them thinking. Let's open it up to our audience to see what kind of questions we have out here. Somebody in the back there. I'm sorry, in the front here.
Hi, my name is Dan Lopez. I work for the city of Chicago. I just had a question. We talked a lot of great discussion about accountability and data as an output. I was wondering if you could speak to any sort of input quality assurance measurements to ensure that the data is accurate and to the user in which it identifies with. And I know personally, as well as my professional life, I've seen how inaccurate data can impact people. I'm just wondering if you could speak about best standards, practices, and how we can better ensure that qualitative information is appropriately quantified or any other data input from maybe a hard piece of paper is appropriately translated into our data systems.
Rosie, do you want to take that one?
It all starts with ensuring that the people who are responsible for collecting and entering this data into the systems are appropriately trained on what to do, that they are familiar with the system, that they know what each metric means, that they know what they're supposed to enter, that you minimize the amount of manual freehand entry that people have to do, to drop downs as much as possible. You have to categorize your data. Because anytime you're asking anybody to freehand data into a system, you are opening yourself up to a million data quality issues and errors. So it goes back to, again, as an analyst, you have to be involved when these systems are being developed. So you can, say, hey, this is what it's going to look like on the reporting. We need to consider what it looks like for the people on the front end. In order for us to make it look like this on the back end, it needs to do this on the front end. And you might want to think about putting some front end validations on this. So if you're looking for a 3-digit number and somebody types in 1 million, it'll say, wait a minute, no, you can't move forward. That's not correct. So just little things that you can do like that to try to put controls in place in the front end of the system to ensure that the data is going to be as accurate as you want it to be. And then also, again, and this is the part that people miss, you have to train the people who are going to be collecting the data. You can't just put something out there and say, hey, put this data in. You need guides, you need classes, you need to talk to them. And then anytime anything is changed, you need to accurately communicate that to them. You can't just slip changes in there and put a notice on the front end of the website and assume they read it. So yeah, it's just, you have to be very dedicated about ensuring that people are informed and trained on how to accurately use the system. As they say, garbage in is garbage out. So you have to be very hyper-vigilant about your data collection.
Daniel?
Yeah, this is a slightly different side. So one of the things that we do when we're trying to understand either how a program's worked or just where people are on various different positions or issues related to Chicago Public Schools is we make sure that the individuals who are being queried around that are also part of the design process. Mm-hmm. And that co-design piece, and so I think, yes, the training is absolutely essential, but the co-design piece often creates a space where the way the questions are being asked sometimes can have a tremendous impact from an input standpoint on what you get back. And as an example, so we've worked on a bunch of different things, but one of the things that we worked on was the free internet program that is now used by CPS called Chicago Connected. And in putting together just the survey, in fact, Rosie did a ton of work on Chicago Connected. So thank you. But in putting together the survey that went out to the users to understand what was working with the program and what wasn't, many of those people were actually part of the design of that survey. And I will say, like, it is not a mistake then that the response rate was like 20% to this survey that went to 25,000 people. Like, we've never seen that kind of thing from surveys that we just kind of built in-house. And they literally changed every single question. Because they're like, this doesn't make sense, this is how it should be reworded. And so I think there's another layer of co-design that could be really powerful as you're thinking about input.
Yeah, and what you're going to hear from our esteemed keynote, you're going to see some results of design and build with and how important that is. And Rosie, thank you for your putting some context around this. In the short time that I've been doing advisory work, I've been telling my clients fewer text boxes, more drop downs, but not 0 text boxes.
No, like 1 or 2 is fine, but
Well, context.
you need to be
is
thinking
important.
about who's going to read all those text responses and categorize them. Is
Right.
it going to be you? You know, that's what you need to consider when you're putting together those kind of data collections.
Large language models, of course.
Well, now, yeah.
Other questions? Right over here.
Hi, my name is Naomi Sheridan. I'm with the nonprofit Chicago Center for Arts and Technology, and this is primarily for Rosie. We receive a lot of funding from the city. All of those different databases, we're putting the same entries in all of those different databases. Would you even know a timeline for the possibility of all those entities to work with each other?
I think that's the answer.
That's I said.
I can't speak to what's happening at the city level. But here's the issue. I mean, but this is the issue that is across many organizations, is that, again, like certain departments or certain teams will have systems that work for their work stream and they feel that they need to use. And that system may or may not be compatible with what everybody else is using. So that's why you're facing the problem of having to go to like 10 different portals and enter in all this different information. Is because instead of, unfortunately, coordinating and collaborating and seeing where we can have synergy across systems, or, you know, see where we can use one system for multiple things so we can, you know, foster this integration, people just kind of want to have their own thing. I'd like to think that now we're moving towards trying to break down these data silos now that people realize the power of, oh, when we combine our data, what insights can we get? It's just, it takes a while to kind of integrate that system. Again, when everybody's using their own thing, you know, especially if somebody's picked something that's not compatible with anything else and they really love it and don't want to let it go. It's a process of trying to get everybody on the same page and then finding systems that talk to each other that can work for everybody.
It's a bigger issue than one government entity asking for multiple different types of reporting. Daniel, you get funding from a variety of sources. I'm sure that they all ask for different things, but it may be 75% of the same thing that what's your experience in this?
You know, I was thinking from a different angle, that we have to deal with all the time, right? Like that's...
You have
but I
different
don't-
funders from
yeah,
different
but I don't
places.
know how you get, because they're not quite the same as government agencies, where you're like, they should be all in the same system, or they should be able to share information across them. You know, my immediate thought was like, knowledge is power. And this is not going to be a popular answer, maybe kind of depressing answer, but I feel like a lot of these agencies are holding on to control.
Oh, no, that's definitely part of it.
Yeah. And so how do you kind of, and what's frustrating from our standpoint is like the data belong to the human that you're measuring, right? Like that it's there. So how do you kind of invert that power dynamic? And I feel like that's part of it. And I do think that there is a slope towards an optimistic outcome where more of these systems are being integrated because people are realizing there's power in integrating them, but that's more recent. And for the time being, my sad answer is I think I'm going to continue to fill out separate forms, and probably you are too.
So how does never sound to you? Is that
I sort of thought that's what it would be, but you know, you can always take the temperature and find out.
Oh, absolutely. And this is,
I'm optimistic.
and you should be optimistic, and it's not unique to the public sector or the civic sector, how many times have you heard stories about one company that has 7 different customer relationship management systems or 7 different medical record systems in one healthcare system? And it's not all, a good part of it is because there's power and knowledge. I think the another pragmatic reason for it is simply that people stand up systems in their own departments because they can build things faster if they do it on their own. And if it has to be hidden from IT, so be it. They can build things on their own and build them faster. And then they operate for a decade or several. And then they start to realize, uh-oh, now we have a problem.
I think one of the solutions that I've seen that is interesting just to think about, and AI is probably the next push of this, is, everybody who uses Google is probably pretty happy when it autofills whatever form you're, and that's pretty recent, right? It used to be, I got to type in my name 600 times. And now it's like, okay, it gets things wrong, but I feel like the solution to what we're getting at is probably going to come from that side first, but crystal ball.
But it goes back to trust.
Yeah.
Because you trust Google
Yes.
mostly.
Yes.
So that credit
To get
card
it right,
pops up,
to get
and
it
you're
right.
like, well, am I really comfortable with this?
Right.
But it comes down to trust, right? I think once that trust is established across different government agencies, and I don't know, we may never get there because, right? But I think trust is what, at its core, is going to make that collaboration and that sharing possible.
Probably about 20, maybe longer years ago, there was a book written by Stephen M.R. Covey, the son of Stephen Covey, called The Speed of Trust, where he actually is able to quantify in dollars the cost of how long it takes you to build trust.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was a while back, and I just recently reread this, and it still holds up. And I gave it to my daughter's boyfriend, and my daughter came and kissed me on the forehead and said, "This has changed our relationship." So,
Were you trying to say something to the boyfriend?
yeah, we had a talk.
Yeah. Started with it.
Other questions from the audience back here?
Hi, I'm not wearing a name tag, but my name is Alex Perez. How do you make your data accessible to historically underserved communities and making sure they're a part of the conversation and creating positive change?
Who wants to take that?
I can start. That's what our work is about. So, I'm curious what others will say, but I think part of that is co-designing, right? For us, we have parent advisory board, we have parent champions, and there's actual work involved, but how do you take data and work with those individuals and say what makes sense, what doesn't, what is this actually trying to say? And then that becomes the tool that you can make more accessible to broader kind of stakeholder groups.
Some of it comes down to access, digital access specifically. When you're building a solution for those who may not have digital access, you have to take that into consideration. One of the canonical examples of a civic tech success story is one where they were trying to help people make informed decisions on the benefits that they have access to. And this was maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago, maybe. To ensure that those that needed to have that information had access to it, they said, we're going to make this available, yes, on the web, but also going to make it available through SMS text messaging because there's a lot of people in this space that don't have access to smartphones, and there's still a lot of feature phones out there, et cetera. So I think a lot of it may be, in addition to co-design, meeting the actual beneficiary where they're at.
I'd also say just thinking about trying to distribute the data through multiple platforms. A lot of people may not have access to a computer, but way more have access to a phone. So just being sure that what you're putting out is mobile compatible, and also partnering with great organizations like K1C that are like going out there and like really interacting with the community on the ground. And like with Chicago Connected, when we first launched it, like we were trying to figure out why didn't we have a stampede of people trying to show up? Word wasn't getting out. K1C came in and like all of a sudden people coming left and right. It was just because they were going out there sharing this information, making people aware and letting people know. So, you know, I would say it's a combination of just trying to make sure that you're hitting multiple platforms and utilizing the partnerships that are available to you.
Other questions? Sir.
My question is around anonymization and privacy when we talk about this trust piece. How do you all think about trying to build trust, especially with different communities, around anonymization collection, anonymization storage, you know, some of those more, I guess, concrete approaches? Have you seen any examples of that? Do you think that's a principle that should be part of how we solve some of these problems, challenges around that? Just kind of curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I won't take it.
I could take it from a technology perspective. One of the things that I've seen that I'm particularly interested in is methods of doing data science against data that you cannot see or cannot access. There's a whole group of technologies, I forget the broader category of it, but it's things like homomorphic encryption, where you can actually do data science on data that needs to be protected and anonymized at at a very deep level. You could do data science on it without ever even decrypting it. So there's a lot of different techniques that are like this, but it relies on people actually knowing about them and using them. Any other things you've seen that have worked? All right.
Well, there's ways that you can set up like your database that can aid in trying to protect the data, like for instance, the CPS in the data warehouse, like students' grades aren't stored in the same table as like their name and their address and the information. All of their information is stored in like different tables and are connected with unique identifiers that are like generic keys. They're just like a series of numbers. So you can't just go into the system and like look up, you know, Johnny and see all of his information. You can go in there and look up his name and maybe his address or whatever, but in order to like connect to like all of his other academic information and pull that in, you would need to know what that student key is and then link to all of the different tables within the database. So I would say if you have the luxury of a data warehouse, not storing all of the information in the same table, spreading it out and then using encryption to link it when you need to analyze.
And if that helps to build trust, that's phenomenal. But it just takes one high-profile snafu, and what does he say? That trust comes in drips.
You gain it in drops, you lose it in buckets.
You gain it in drops, you lose it in buckets. Mm-hmm. So true. We have time for, I think, one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. David Merriman, College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. I guess along the same lines, have you thought about, or what do you think about the potential for synthetic data? I know that they've started to use the tax data some, where they can take the real data, make synthetic data that sort of mirrors it, and it seems to me like that would be tremendous potential for researchers.
Do you want me to take that? Okay. I'm excited about synthetic data. You use synthetic data when you don't have enough training data to go on to build an effective model. I'm also concerned about synthetic data. I think, Laura, I think you mentioned this in the first panel, that synthetic data is built off of existing training data. And if there is biases that are baked into the existing training data, it could very well get leaked into the synthetic data. So I think it solves one problem in that you're building enough data to effectively and surprisingly effectively to build out effective models. It doesn't remove algorithmic bias, and it doesn't remove all the data bias. Is that sort of where you're going with this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about it in terms of the potential for allowing researchers much better access
Yes.
to data and still protect anonymity. That's what excites me about it.
Protect anonymity because it's synthetic.
Yeah, because it's synthetic, so there's no real people involved. But the data, effectively, if we're interested in policy questions, we might be able to answer policy questions with synthetic data as well as we could with real data.
That's a really good point. Yeah, from a research perspective, it's a fantastic tool. I'd like to thank my panelists here. I'd like to thank Omar, Rosie, Daniel for being here today. Thank UIC and Joe.
And thank you, Adam, for moderating.
My pleasure.